Tonight, the unthinkable happened, and the world will never look at Middle Eastern air power the same way again. In the span of a single night, 40 of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever constructed, the F-35 Adair, the crown jewel of Israeli air superiority, each unit worth over $100 million, were destroyed on the ground before a single pilot could reach a cockpit. $4 billion in American-built aerospace technology vaporized in darkness, not by a pure military with aircraft carriers and satellite constellations, by Iran, by a nation that Washington has spent 5 decades trying to strangle through sanctions, covert operations, and relentless diplomatic pressure. The instrument of destruction was the Fath-360, a precision ballistic missile system that the Western defense establishment had largely dismissed as a regional nuisance, a short-range weapon, a propaganda piece, something to be intercepted, neutralized, managed. Last night, that dismissal cost Israel its entire forward airstrike capability in a single operational window. Nevatim Air Base, the primary home of Israel's F-35 fleet, and the launch point for every major Israeli airstrike across the region, was hit by a coordinated salvo so precise, so compressed in timeline, and so overwhelming in volume that Iron Dome, David Sling, and every layer of layered defense Israel possessed could not prevent the catastrophe from unfolding. By the time the smoke cleared over the Negev desert, the strategic equation of the Middle East had been permanently rewritten. Israel had entered the night as the dominant air power in the region. It exited the night as a nation without an offensive air force. And Washington, which had guaranteed Israel's qualitative military edge as a cornerstone of American foreign policy for half a century, found itself staring at a gap in its regional architecture that no emergency resupply can fill overnight. Tonight's analysis takes you inside the strike. We will break down the Fath-3's technical architecture and why it defeated every defense system thrown against it. We will examine how Iran planned and executed a simultaneous multi-base assault without triggering early warning until it was too late. We will assess what the loss of 40 F-35s means for Israel's capacity to continue operating across every theater it is currently engaged in. And we will map the geopolitical shock wave now radiating outward from this single night, reaching Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and every Gulf capital simultaneously. The truth of what happened last night is more consequential than anything the mainstream defense media is currently willing to say out loud. Before we go further, if this channel is giving you analysis that cuts deeper than what you're finding anywhere else, hit like, subscribe, and drop your sharpest assessment in the comments. Every engagement keeps this work independent and sharp. 3 questions will anchor tonight's full analysis. First, how did Iran execute a coordinated strike across multiple hardened Israeli air bases simultaneously without triggering an adequate early warning response? Second, what is the Fath-360 actually capable of? And why did the most expensive missile defense architecture in the Middle East fail to stop it? Third, with Israel's F-35 fleet destroyed and its offensive air capacity gutted, what comes next? And does Washington have any realistic response that doesn't risk igniting a full regional war? The answers are not comfortable, but they are necessary. If you have been following this channel through the escalating sequence of events across the past several weeks, you already understand that what we are witnessing is not a series of isolated military incidents. It is a structured, patient, methodically executed campaign to fundamentally alter the balance of power across the Middle East, and last night represented its most consequential single operation Subscribe now if you haven't already. Share this analysis with anyone who is serious about understanding what is actually happening. The comment section is open. Tell me what you think the next move looks like from Thran, from Tel Aviv, and from Washington. The strike. What actually happened at Nevatim and beyond. To understand the full magnitude of last night, you need to understand what Natam Air Base actually represents within Israel's military architecture. This is not simply an airfield. Natam is the operational heart of Israeli air dominance across the entire region. It houses the majority of Israel's F-35 IADER fleet, the most technologically advanced combat aircraft on Earth, equipped with sensor fusion systems, low observable coatings, and network warfare capabilities that no other air force in the Middle East can match. Every major Israeli airstrike against Iranian assets in Syria over the past several years originated from Nevatim. Every deep strike mission against Hezbollah's precision missile manufacturing infrastructure. Every covert penetration of defended airspace, it all flows through Nevatim. Destroying Nevatim's flight line is not merely destroying aircraft. It is destroying Israel's ability to project offensive power across the entire regional chessboard simultaneously. Iran understood this with absolute clarity. The targeting logic behind last night's operation was not random. It was the product of years of intelligence collection, operational planning, and patient preparation for exactly this moment. The strike sequence began at 2:17 inches the morning local time, a timing choice that was itself a deliberate calculation. Israeli air defense crews were at their lowest alert readiness. The watch rotation had just changed. Processing speed at radar stations and command centers was at its overnight minimum. This is not coincidence. Iranian operational planners selected the launch window based on detailed knowledge of Israeli defense cycle patterns. Knowledge accumulated through years of electronic intelligence collection, drone overflights, and human intelligence networks that Western analysts consistently underestimated. The opening phase of the assault involved a wave of decoy UAVs, small, low observable platforms that flooded the radar environment with targets simultaneously. Israeli air defense radar networks were suddenly processing hundreds of incoming signatures from multiple approach vectors. The computer systems managing Iron Dome battery allocation and David's Sling intercept assignment were thrown into a prioritization overload that military systems engineers call saturation paralysis. Every battery in the network began cycling through target assignment sequences faster than its reload capacity could support. This is the trap. While every available interceptor in northern and central Israel was being committed to the decoy wave, the Fa-360 salvos were already airborne from launch positions in western Iran and from mobile platforms prepositioned through Iraqi territory, locations that Israeli early warning arrays were not adequately oriented to cover at the angles of approach that were used. The Fa-360 missiles arrived in groups of 8 to 12, targeted against specific hardened shelters within the Nevatim complex. The timing compression between the first impact and the last was under 4 minutes. In 4 minutes, Israel had no realistic path to an effective, coordinated response. The base's internal alert system was still processing the initial warning when the second and third salvos were already in terminal descent. Simultaneously, and this is the element that most shocked IDF command, a parallel strike package hit Ramon Air Base in the southern Negev, where Israel had pre-positioned a reserve contingent of F-35S and conventional F-161 aircraft as a dispersal measure following earlier escalation warnings. The fact that Iran knew about this dispersal, knew the precise locations within Ramon where the aircraft had been relocated, represents an intelligence penetration of Israeli operational security at a depth that has not been publicly acknowledged by any official Israeli source. But the impact craters tell the story that the press releases do not. By 2:47 inches the morning, 30 minutes after the first launch detection, the operational assessment reaching IDF Air Force headquarters contained numbers that commanders initially refused to believe. 40 aircraft confirmed destroyed or critically damaged. 3 hardened shelter complexes at Nevatim rendered structurally compromised. The primary fuel ammunition storage node at the base hit and burning. Ramon's dispersal area struck with comparable accuracy. Israel's offensive air capability, the instrument upon which every component of its regional strategy depends, had been effectively neutralized in a single half-hour operational window. The magnitude of this achievement cannot be overstated by reference to any previous precedent in Middle Eastern military history. In the 19676-day war, Israel destroyed the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces in a preemptive strike that lasted approximately 3 hours. Last night, Iran executed the functional equivalent, destroying Israel's most capable aircraft on the ground in 30 minutes, with ballistic missiles from a distance of over 0 kilometers against an adversary. They had been on elevated alert for weeks and had every reason to expect a major Iranian military response. The precision demonstrated is itself the most important military datum of the entire engagement. Fath-360 impacts were concentrated within specific shelter bays, not distributed across the general base area. Missiles were not hitting the runway or the perimeter. They were hitting the exact building coordinates where F-35s were parked and maintained. This level of terminal accuracy delivered by a ballistic weapon at range requires targeting data of extraordinary resolution and a guidance system of exceptional capability. Both of those requirements point towards something that Western intelligence has been reluctant to fully acknowledge: the degree to which Iran's precision strike capability has matured over the past 5 years under conditions of complete economic blockade and technological isolation. The F-360 inside the weapon that rewrote the rules. The F-360 entered the Western defense analysis community's awareness gradually and without particular alarm. Its stated specifications: a range of approximately 120 kilometers, a solid fuel propulsion system, a reported circular error probable in the single-digit meter range, placed it in the category of short to medium range precision ballistic systems. Analysts noted it with measured interest. It was cataloged, assessed, and largely filed under the heading of a regional tactical system useful for hitting fixed targets within a limited operational radius, but not a strategic game changer in the same category as Iran's longer-range Shahab or Sagiel systems. Last night demolished that assessment with the same thoroughness that the missiles themselves demolished Israel's aircraft shelters. What the Western analytical community consistently underweighted was not the FA-360's range. It was the combination of its terminal guidance architecture, its salvo employment doctrine, and the operational infrastructure Iran had quietly built to deploy it at scale from dispersed and mobile launch platforms across a geography far wider than its nominal range envelope suggested. Let us start with the terminal guidance system, because this is where the Fath-360 separates itself from every previous generation of Iranian ballistic weapons. Conventional ballistic missiles, including earlier Iranian systems, follow a predictable trajectory through most of their flight path. They can be tracked. Their impact point can be calculated with sufficient accuracy to assign an intercept solution within the time window available to a competent defense system. This is the foundational assumption on which every component of Israel's layered missile defense architecture was designed. The Fath-360 invalidates that assumption in its final phase of flight. As the missile descends through the terminal phase, an onboard guidance system combining inertial navigation with an electro-optical terminal seeker and a radar altimeter activates and begins comparing the ground signature beneath the missile against a preloaded digital target model. This is not a system that is simply following GPS coordinates. It is a system that is looking at the ground, identifying specific structures, and steering itself toward a designated point on a specific building with an accuracy that GPS alone cannot achieve. And more critically, an accuracy that GPS jamming cannot degrade because the system is no longer dependent on GPS in its final guidance phase. This terminal seeker architecture explains two things simultaneously. It explains the extraordinary accuracy of last night's strikes, impacts clustered within specific shelter bays rather than distributed across the base. And it explains why American GPS jamming operations, which had been running continuously across the region for weeks, produced no meaningful degradation in Iranian strike accuracy. The propulsion system compounds the defense challenge. Solid fuel propellant means the Fath-360 requires no liquid fueling sequence before launch. A mobile launcher can arrive at a pre-surveyed firing position, erect, and launch within minutes. The launch signature, the thermal bloom that satellites and airborne surveillance systems use to detect missile launches, exists for a fraction of the time that liquid fuel systems require. The warning timeline compresses dramatically. Now, layer on top of this the salvo employment doctrine that Iran developed and refined specifically to exploit the reload limitations of Israel's point defense batteries. A single Fath-360 fired against a defended target can be intercepted. The intercept probability is not zero. Iron Dome and David Sling are genuine engineering achievements and should not be dismissed. But Iran was not firing single missiles at defended targets. Iran was firing salvos of 8 to 12 missiles against each designated aim point, with the salvo compressed into a launch window of under 90 seconds from a single battery, and with multiple batteries targeting the same facilities from different approach vectors simultaneously against a salvo of 8 missiles, arriving from 2 different approach angles within a 30-second window. A point defense battery faces a mathematics problem that has no good solution. It can engage some of the incoming weapons. It cannot engage all of them. And the missiles that the battery does not engage reach their target. Iran's targeting teams calculated the intercept capacity of each Israeli defense battery in the coverage zone. The number of missiles each battery could engage within a specific time window given its reload cycle. Designed their salvo sizes and timing to exceed that capacity by a defined margin. This is not guesswork. This is a careful engineering analysis of the adversary's defense architecture applied to the problem of overwhelming it. The production scale of the Fath-360 program adds a dimension that deserves separate emphasis. These are not exotic, individually hand-assembled weapons produced in small quantities for prestige demonstrations. Iranian manufacturing facilities operating under full sanctions pressure with zero access to Western components or precision machine tooling from sanctioned suppliers have been producing Fath-360 systems at a rate that has quietly built a stockpile of meaningful operational depth. The missiles used last night represent a fraction of Iran's available inventory. This is not a one-time capability demonstration. It is a sustainable strike architecture. The self-reliance dimension of this achievement deserves to be stated clearly because it carries implications that extend far beyond this single conflict. Every component of the Fath-360 propellant chemistry guidance, electronics, structural materials, manufacturing, tooling, was developed and produced entirely within Iran. The sanctions architecture that Washington constructed with the explicit intent of preventing Iran from developing exactly this kind of capability has failed in its core objective. Not partially failed, completely failed. What the sanctions actually produce, the outcome that no one in the Western policy establishment wants to state plainly, is an Iranian defense industrial base that is now more self-sufficient, more resilient, and more capable of absorbing external pressure than it would have been if Iran had been allowed to purchase weapons systems freely on the international market. Isolation forced innovation. Necessity produced engineering solutions that imported systems would never have generated, because purchase systems do not require the buyer to understand them at the level required to build them from first principles. Iran built the Fath-360 from first principles. That is why it performs the way it performs, and that is why no Western sanction package can eliminate it. The international defense community is now conducting an emergency reassessment of every Iranian ballistic system that has been similarly underestimated. If the Fath-360's terminal accuracy and salvo doctrine are indicative of the design philosophy applied across Iran's missile inventory, then the threat calculus for every American base, every allied facility, and every naval asset operating within range of Iranian launch platforms needs to be fundamentally revised. That reassessment is happening right now in classified spaces in Washington, London, and Tel Aviv. The conclusions being reached are not comfortable. Washington's response, paralysis behind the podium. Within hours of the Nevatim strikes, the White House Situation Room was operating at maximum density. The National Security Council convened an emergency session. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs was on secure video link with CENTCOM headquarters in Qatar. The Secretary of State was working the phones to every Gulf partner simultaneously. And from all of that frantic activity, what emerged in the public space was a statement expressing deep concern, reaffirming America's commitment to Israel's security and calling on all parties to exercise restraint. Restraint. The word landed in Tel Aviv like a second strike. To understand the depth of Washington's paralysis in this moment, you need to understand the operational problem that the Fath-360 strike has created for American military planners. Not just politically, but in pure military terms. The standard American response playbook to a major Iranian escalation involves a sequence of steps. First, demonstrate overwhelming air power presence through carrier strike group positioning and bomber deployments to the region. Second, present Iran with a credible threat of devastating retaliation against its own military infrastructure. Third, use that threat to compel de-escalation through diplomatic back channels. Fourth, if diplomacy fails, execute precision strikes against Iranian military assets that degrade capability without triggering a full regional war. Every step in that playbook now faces a complication that did not exist 48 hours ago. Step 1. Demonstrating air power presence requires moving carrier strike groups into operational range. But the repositioning of American carriers away from the Gulf of Oman in recent days following the demonstration of Iranian anti-airship missile capability means that the nearest American carrier Aviation is currently operating from standoff distances that significantly reduce the tempo and volume of strike missions it can generate. Moving carriers back into the Gulf requires accepting a risk level that American Naval Command has just explicitly demonstrated it is not comfortable accepting. Step 2. Presenting a credible retaliation threat requires that Iran believes the threat will be executed. But Iran's behavior last night, striking 40 F-35s inside hardened shelters at the most heavily defended airbase in the Middle East, reflects a leadership calculation that American retaliation will be constrained by exactly the factors that are now visibly constraining it. Tehran's decision to execute last night's strike was itself a statement that they do not believe Washington's retaliation threat will be unlimited. Step 3. Diplomatic back channels require a partner that perceives itself to be in a disadvantageous position and is therefore motivated to negotiate. Iran this morning is not in that position. Iran this morning controls the momentum of the conflict. Step 4. Precision strikes against Iranian military assets runs directly into the question that American planners have been unable to answer cleanly for years. What do you hit? Iran's missile forces are dispersed across mobile platforms and hardened underground facilities, distributed across a vast national territory. A precision strike campaign against Iranian missile infrastructure would need to be massive in scale and sustained in duration to achieve meaningful degradation. Massive and sustained means escalation. Escalation, in this context, refers to Iran activating the full spectrum of its regional network. This includes coordinated responses from Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi forces in Yemen, and various Iraqi militia groups operating in concert. Such a multi-front activation would represent a regional conflict of significant scale and complexity, one that American military planners, even with advanced modeling, cannot confidently guarantee will conclude within an acceptable cost or risk framework. This underlying reality is a central factor in Washington's measured and often restrained posture. It is not necessarily political hesitation, but rather a calculated recognition that available military options carry consequences that no administration can easily absorb. Compounding the challenge is the question of resupply. Israel's reported loss of 40 F-35 aircraft represents a substantial depletion of its most advanced combat fleet. Given that the United States maintains a global inventory of roughly 450 F-35A aircraft, replacing such losses quickly would require diverting assets from active U.S. squadrons, thereby reducing operational readiness in other regions. Meanwhile, production rates for new F-35s, while steadily increasing, are still constrained by industrial capacity and supply chain limitations. Restoring such a gap would realistically take years under standard procurement timelines. This situation raises an additional and pressing strategic concern: the vulnerability of American air bases in the region. Facilities such as Al Udeid in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, and Incirlik in Turkey are critical nodes in U.S. military posture. However, these bases were not originally designed to withstand highly concentrated, precision-guided ballistic missile strikes of the type described in recent scenarios. The ability to target specific infrastructure elements at long range introduces new risk calculations for base defense, force dispersal, and regional contingency planning. Gulf states are closely observing these developments. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are reassessing their security frameworks, particularly their reliance on U.S. deterrence guarantees. For some, this may accelerate existing diplomatic engagement channels with Iran, while others may consider diversifying their strategic partnerships. Hosting U.S. forces, once seen purely as a stabilizing factor, is now being weighed against the potential of becoming a direct target in a broader conflict environment. From Israel's perspective, the implications are profound. For decades, Israeli defense doctrine has been built on the principle of maintaining uncontested air superiority. This capability has not only provided a military advantage, but has also served as a cornerstone of deterrence. The ability to project air power across the region at will has allowed Israel to shape conflicts, respond rapidly to threats, and maintain strategic initiative. A significant degradation of that capability would represent a structural shift in how Israel conducts operations. Reduced air assets would impact ongoing engagements, including operations in Gaza, where air support plays a critical role in close coordination with ground forces. It will also affect northern defense considerations involving Hezbollah, where the perceived threat of Israeli air retaliation has historically served as a deterrent against escalation. In Syria, where Israel has conducted repeated air operations targeting weapons transfers and infrastructure linked to adversarial groups, operational freedom could be constrained under conditions of reduced fleet availability. Beyond the military dimension, the economic implications are substantial. The reported cost of each F-35 aircraft exceeds $100 million, meaning that the loss of 40 aircraft represents a multi-billion-dollar financial impact, excluding associated infrastructure, munitions, and logistical assets. For a defense budget of Israel's scale, such a loss is significant and would require either emergency domestic allocation, increased external support, or a combination of both. Unlike commercial assets, military equipment of this nature is not insured in a conventional sense, making replacement a matter of national and allied budgetary priorities. Equally important is the psychological and societal impact. While prior incidents involving missile interception failures were absorbed within the broader perception of system resilience, a scenario involving the destruction of advanced aircraft on the ground challenges foundational assumptions about national security. It raises questions about preparedness, intelligence coverage, and the robustness of layered defense systems. These questions inevitably enter public discourse, influencing political debate and policy direction. Politically, such an event would likely trigger intense internal scrutiny within Israel. Government officials would face demands for accountability regarding intelligence lapses, operational readiness, and strategic planning. Opposition voices would amplify these concerns, while the public would seek reassurance about the effectiveness of existing defense frameworks. The credibility of long-standing assumptions about invulnerability becomes a central issue of national discussion. At a broader level, the implications extend beyond a single state. A shift of this magnitude would reverberate through global power dynamics. Long-standing assumptions underpinning the post-Cold War regional order, particularly those related to American military primacy and guaranteed qualitative advantages for allies, would come under renewed examination. Other global powers, including Russia and China, would interpret such developments through the lens of their own strategic interests. For Russia, sustained U.S. attention in the Middle East could indirectly relieve pressure on other geopolitical fronts. For China, developments of this nature align with its long-term focus on anti-access and area denial strategies, reinforcing the relevance of asymmetric deterrence approaches. Meanwhile, countries across the Middle East, as well as nations like Turkey, Pakistan, and India, would continue to reassess their diplomatic and security alignments in response to evolving realities. Ultimately, what emerges from such a scenario is not a single decisive shift, but a cumulative re-evaluation of assumptions across multiple capitals. Each state recalibrates its position based on observed capabilities, perceived risks, and shifting balances of power. The result is a more fluid, multipolar environment in which influence is increasingly distributed rather than centralized. In this context, the idea of uncontested dominance gives way to a more complex and negotiated balance. Regional actors are no longer solely shaped by external guarantees, but are increasingly asserting agency through indigenous capabilities, strategic partnerships, and adaptive diplomacy. Whether this leads to greater stability or prolonged uncertainty depends on how states respond to these changing conditions, and whether mechanisms for dialogue and de-escalation can keep pace with the evolving strategic landscape.